Hi everyone. So the last one is hierarchical clustering. So one disadvantage of the k-mean clustering is that k has to be pre-specified, and k is so crucial for the final result. So the hierarchical clustering doesn't have such an assumption. So it starts with no clustering, so that means n clusters if there are n observations, and it groups the most similar observations or most similar existing groups one by one to get smaller number of clusters. Okay, so this is algorithm. So at first, this pane is original data. So which observations are closest? Then fifth observation and seventh observations are closest. So we make one small cluster here. So next, which observations are closest? Then 1 and 6 are closest, so we make one cluster here. So next, how to decide? Actually, at this point, we want to also define the distance between cluster and observation, and also cluster and a cluster. So there are several rules. For example, how to determine distance between this 8th observation and this cluster. You can take minimum distance or average distance or maximum distance. We have several rules, but with some rule that we can classify 8 as the same cluster as 5 and 7. So in this way, we can make each cluster larger and larger, and finally, we have all observations in one cluster. If we stop at some point, then we can have the cluster with arbitrary number of clusters. So the dendrogram is useful tool to determine how to cluster observations. So the dendrogram illustrates how all observations are clustered. So when the number of clusters k is given, the dendrogram identifies the clustering result. And most trivial clustering is just use one cluster. Every observations are in the same cluster. So here, so each line, so this vertical line corresponds to one observation. And it means that this observation and these observations are really close. So we cluster these two observations at very early stage. And finally, we have connected all observations, and finally we have k is equal to 1. And the second graph is the same as the first one, but if we want to decide k is equal to 2, then we can use this threshold. So in this way, so this is one cluster and the other is another cluster. If we want to have k is equal to 3, then we can use this threshold. So this is one cluster, this is another, and this is another. You can certainly see this green cluster and this light green cluster are more similar compared to this purple cluster. So how many clusters we need? It really depends on the problem. For example, the human and the chimpanzee and gorilla. Maybe you want to distinguish human with the others, but sometimes maybe it's more useful to distinguish those 3 groups. Okay, so this is the end of chapter X. Okay, so now you can solve the last quiz 326-5 in Canvas. Okay, see you then.